Yes, great, terrific. So welcome to this Digital Writers Festival panel, the politics and possibilities of virtual reality. I'm here with Mez in this virtual space.
Hey,
But before I begin, even though this is a virtual space, we have to, we're all beaming in from stolen land. So I'll start with an acknowledgement of country. To begin, we would like to acknowledge the First Nations, first storytellers and traditional owners of the land the panelists are broadcasting from, the Bunurong, Wurundjeri and Gundungurra peoples. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and the elders of the lands this broadcast reaches. Furthermore, we recognise sovereignty was never ceded and that the struggle for justice continues. So presumably if you're watching this, you'll know exactly why you're here, but I'll just read the event blurb. The event is what happens when we go beyond imagining to immersing ourselves in alternate realities. The rise of virtual reality technology has transformed what is possible in storytelling and advanced our ability to imagine worlds. What kinds of worlds may be possible through VR and who may benefit? The interactive lecture will be held in a virtual space, this virtual space, and explores the power dynamics of virtual reality. So it's a Digital Writers Festival event, and it's brought to you in partnership with Overland Literary Journal. I'll just give one blurb for Overland. Overland's a literary journal that's been around since 1954. It was started by the Realist Writers Group, part of the Communist Party at the time, and it's a left-wing radical literary journal that publishes short fiction, essays and poetry. And we've got a subscribe-a-thon happening from November 9 to 16, where you can subscribe and possibly win terrific prizes. So you'll notice that it's just myself and Mez here. I will bring in Mark now. So Mark didn't have the technology for this presentation, which is going to be one of the questions we come to. So I have to bring him in through a Google Doc, which is going to be on the screen very soon.
any minute now.
Any minute now. So I'm typing with one finger in this remote. Okay. But I did make some short URLs because I knew this would happen. Okay. Hello, Mark.
Hey, Mark, we can read you.
Yes, we can read you. So welcome, Mark and Mez. I'll read your bios out first. So with me I'm Benjamin Laird. I'm the website producer for Overland and also an electronic poet and software developer. With me is Mez Breeze. She crafts VR and AR experiences, games, experimental storytelling, virtual reality literature, and other genre-defying output. Mez's VR experience, Our Cupidity Coda, was a finalist in the 2018 Experimental New Media Art Awards and the 2018 Queensland Literary Awards. In 2018, Mez partnered with Microsoft, Samsung, and Masterpiece VR for their VR Influencers Sustainability Initiative. Mez currently serves as an advisor to the Mixed Augmented Reality Art Research Organisation, as a co-founder to the XR Artist Collectives, and is a senior research affiliate of the Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab. And Mark Riboldi, who is up on the screen here in this Google Doc. Most of Mark's writing doesn't have a name on it, notwithstanding those half-finished novels and screenplays on obsolete floppy disks somewhere. He's worked as a policy and media advisor in New South Wales Parliament, as a communications advisor on numerous election campaigns, and is currently the advocacy of communications manager at Community and Legal Centres New South Wales. Mark is into the intersection of technology, philosophy, politics, and popular culture. The belief, possibly misguided, that he can change the world for better keeps getting in the way of completing a sprawling galactic adventure novel. And he relaxes with graphic novels and video games. So thank you both for joining me. I should say that, this panel was very much influenced by the terrific work that Mez does, which is amazing. So after this, if you haven't seen her work, you should definitely go to her website and start looking at some of the wonderful writing there, or experimental. How would you describe your work pieces, Mez?
Well, there's so many, but I would say just experimental storytelling probably covers the whole shebang.
That's good. Okay, experimental storytelling. And also by Mark Riboldi's essay about virtual reality that was published last year in Overland. And that Overland did a little stereoscopic adaptation of. Okay.
Oh, really? Wow. I have to look that up. I didn't know that, Mark.
It's 3D CSS, so it's very fragile, but it allows you to read his essay by being completely surrounded by it.
Fantastic.
And yes, which he obviously wrote without VR. This is like one of those things where we're on a starship and we're the people and he's the computer.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess yeah. Open the pod bay doors, Mark.
I wouldn't do that if I were you, Dave. I mean, Benjamin.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's go into it. I've got a few different questions. We'll see what we get through, and perhaps we'll just take these as starting points and then we can go into some of the discussions. So I thought I'd start with Mark. Being that we're in a virtual space, myself and Mez, I thought I'd begin with the idea of reality. We have an artificial space here in this event, but as you run your essay, Baudrillard, I think I'm getting that pronunciation vaguely correct, suggests that we may have lost the ability to recognize what's real. My question then is, how is reality already artificial, and how does VR challenge or perhaps aggravate those distinctions? So I guess the first question is, what is real? Reality.
Great question.
It is. So, because it's different to every person, we're born into bounded environments to make choices in. There's also luck involved. Whoa. I'll scroll that. So what we might be talking about is collective reality. Which we might agree is the world we live in. Whoa, I think he created a new page. Ah, terrific. Our collective middle-class Western reality is far divorced from the constructions of everything we engage with and
consume,
including our technology. So did you want to also weigh in on that, Mez?
Yeah, I like the idea of collective reality. It's a nice phrase. It's interesting, and I understand that the base question of what is real or what is reality is such a difficult one, and it's a difficult one in
Yeah.
terms of applying it to these new realities. That the terminology that I kind of embrace is the term extended reality, and that's an umbrella term for technology like virtual reality and augmented reality and mixed reality. And all those terms can be interchangeable, on some levels. Taxonomy is all over the shop in terms of the field. So it's interesting to pair it back to kind of base philosophy, I guess, and work out what's
Yeah.
real and what isn't. But what I was
And it
going...
is,
Sorry, Benjamin, go
sorry,
ahead.
continue.
No, you go.
Oh, no, you go. Okay. Yeah, because I was just gonna, this is the tiny bit of latency makes it quite difficult and interesting, the conversation.
It does.
And you can see, I suppose, the distinctions, all these kinds of separate consensual realities with the way that media appeals to certain groups or certain groups engage with media. And then in some ways, the artificial nature of virtual reality highlights, seems to highlight the constructed nature of perhaps the world outside.
Yeah, absolutely. When I first started to, well, I actually first started to get into the field of virtual reality in the mid-1990s. Yes, I am that old. And back then, there was a thing called VRML, which was virtual reality markup language. And it basically enabled you to create really what today's equivalent would be is 360 videos. But then I kind of took a leap into augmented reality, and that was in the 2008, where I started a project. And as part of that project, which was called Augmentology 101, so, a lot of thought put into that one, I gathered a group of theorists and people together, and we all kind of started to throw ideas at the wall, and created an interesting kind of set of texts all about, what is real, what is kind of coming up in terms of the emergent VR, AR space. And
right.
So,
I think we're losing. I think we're
okay.
losing Mark. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yeah, I think he's just pointing out that
Okay, great.
he can't hear me.
I'm just going to hold you close and see if you can hear Mez a little bit.
Any audio?
Yes. Brilliant. Okay, so he can.
Awesome.
Sorry,
okay.
Continue, Mez. I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. Mark, I was just outlining a project that I developed in 2008 with some other theorists, and we were talking about these very notions of what is real, what's phenomenologically real, what's classified as that, how that intersects with emergent technology, and a whole lot of things. And as part of that, I actually came across Paul Milgram's definition of the reality virtuality continuum, I think it was. And it's a really interesting definition, because he basically posits that we have what we know as the real, and then on a continuum that goes to what's virtual. But in the middle is this really amorphous kind of area called what he calls mixed reality. And at the time, that really kind of resonated in terms of it's not a binary construction, it's more kind of fluid. And that mixed reality conception kind of, it covers a mix of augmented reality and the corporal. So yeah, a very kind of interesting way of trying to shoehorn, what is essentially a very complex philosophical question into, a scientific framing. So yeah, very interesting. And if anybody wants to look it up, it's Paul Milgram, and I strongly advise you do.
I will. It sounds very interesting. I suppose this takes me to uh, my next question, and something a film that Mark writes about in his essay, particularly in regards to philosophy, is The Matrix, probably one of the best known of the late '90s. And so while we're in the '90s, I thought I'd ask this. Rather than, I guess, a continuum, those series of late '90s films, which appeared in 1998 and 1999, like Dark City, The 13th Floor, Existence, and even Fight Club, suggested that there was, I guess, a binary, one that how can, a question that it raises is how can we be sure of the reality we're in? But a second is that there actually is this second reality that these artificial kind of places are in contrast to, and that we're tricked into realizing these existences as being real when in fact that is that there is another reality. Is there a certain, I guess, sense of unreality? Is there a certainty, sorry, in the unreality of VR that we don't have in reality? Like when we take these VR headsets off or when we start walking around, is there a sense that our experiences may not be as tangible as we expect them to be?
So should I field that, or Mark, do you want to? Maybe I should answer, and while you're typing out your response, Mark.
Yeah, I think
Actually,
that would be good.
yeah. Well, I'll keep it relatively short.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that there's a type of certainty in the unreality of VR, because I guess, I don't subscribe to that real, unreal, binary kind of way of looking at it. I guess I see it more as expanding our versions of reality. So I think VR has amazing potential for entertainment, education, even social connection, and also for people to experience behaviours that we're restricted from in everyday life. Say, I'm trying to think of Eagle Flight, a app that's on the Oculus store that I've only used very briefly, but basically you're a massive eagle and you're flying through this absolutely beautiful city. And to experience that, of course there's no kind of haptic analog idea accompanying that, but it's just so amazing in terms of the perspective, the shifting, and you really do fall into that. So I guess that's where, I kind of take odds with that uncertainty idea. But yeah, that's just my take. Shall we see what Mark's got to say?
Yes. So I'll just read out what Mark's written. I think anyone who has immersed in VR or had a video game or a book has had that feeling coming out of stepping into a new world, of the real world feeling a little unreal. And if I can... Ooh. Google Doc is...
I'll read it out if you like. Mark goes on to say, I think those films would tell you that the only certainty is that there are multiple realities, and it's a lot less confusing when they are separate. That's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and I suppose those multiple realities can exist on that continuum. Do you think, with that eagle, that there is potential for virtual reality to, I think I've heard referred to as empathy machines, to build, to give people experiences of things that they wouldn't otherwise, and so change the way that they think?
Yeah, their orientation and perspective. It's funny, Chris Milk, who coined that phrase, I actually had a conversation with him in a virtual reality environment called the Museum of... Yeah, I know, it was amazing. I was fangirling, going, oh, it's Chris Milk, and then ended up in a conversation, and he basically said that phrase, I think he coined it in a TED talk, I think it was, but he came up with it on the plane on the way to the TED talk, and since then it's kind of dogged him, like it's the catchphrase that is there. And he was saying he still believes in it, but when I was kind of talking about the different layers of empathy and how there's the latest research is that there's actually different varieties of empathy, that's when it gets quite complicated. But I mean, that's just an aside, but I definitely think in terms of that disconnection, and it's funny that Mark is referencing, the amazing, I can't think of the term, but the experience that we have when we watch a film or we read a book and we are thoroughly immersed. I mean, Coleridge uses that great phrase, willing suspension of disbelief. You really are in that world that's being created. And it's funny to think of even a book, a print-based book, not even a ebook or digital book, can have almost the same immersive quality if you actually fall into that willing state of disbelief, that you disengage or you disconnect from the primary reality we're in, let's say, and just fall into it. So it's a very interesting way of framing things. And in terms of that phrase, empathy machine, one of the very first experiences I had in VR was I guess what you'd call a music video called Surge. And it was, you seen it?
I haven't.
Right. It's just such an overwhelming sensory-based experience of these, you're placed in this huge environment. There's kind of blocks going over you in the sky that turn into giant figures. Sorry, spoiler alert, should have said that first. And the music is just fantastic. And there was something there that I really went, it's not, I mean, I hate to use the phrase game changer, but there was something about it where I went, the immersion and the potential for placing yourself into a different set of shoes, like really going, I can connect with a different experience, a different perceptual way of viewing the world. Yeah, I was pretty much hooked.
Yeah, and there is a lot to say about the immersive quality of all those other forms of media, but it is quite interesting. Even in this room, I can look around and see the sky and the details, and I guess there is a much lighter cognitive load for me to be immersed here than it is in other forms of art and literature and so on. Not that they can't be evocative, but that I can think far less in order to get that experience.
Yeah, definitely.
And that is quite interesting. So my partner and I the other day, so this is Mark, we're talking about the things that we need to do to recharge. My thing is immersion in the world, whether that's a book, TV series, or a video game. And that is I need to step out of
reality. What a great phrase. I need to step out of reality. Nice.
Yeah. For many years I did live role playing, and that was one of a common phrase heard by many for players is that reality sucks, and the alternate world of live action role playing was their preferred place to be.
Fantastic.
So with this immersion, one of the things that VR has been used to do, and this was in Mark's essay as well, and we talked about this previously, was for treating things like PTSD or phobias. And I know you mentioned, Mez, that you tried out one of the phobia alleviating apps, even if they didn't need to. Do you think there is a reason why these treatments are more successful in VR? Is it purely the immersion? Like, and if so, what are the risks, or is it really just hype? We can, use VR to solve problem X because no one will get funded.
Yeah, it's
it might be an issue.
Okay.
Apparently I'm quite glitchy.
Okay, your audio is a little bit choppy, but it's still reasonably okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, hopefully I'll get through.
Okay, we'll soldier on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I'm by no means an expert. Mark, if you want to chime in, just keep typing, and I'll just chat away while you're putting stuff up there. I was very curious initially to try an app, a VR app that kind of spoke to phobia treatment, just to see what the hell it was like. And this is when I was using my Oculus Rift. I'll get to why I don't use the Oculus Rift anymore a bit later, but this is when I was. And the app, I think this is in 2016, so my memory is a bit shaky, but I'll try and talk you through it. It was called Fearless, and from what I can tell, it was based on a systematic desensitization approach. So that's a psychological approach where you have something that you're terrified of, scared of, phobia, and basically you're introduced to it very incrementally. It's a slow build up to try and, disarm the power of whatever that phobia is. So this Fearless app was very ingenious. When you first put yourself into the VR space, the space presented as a therapist's office, books on the walls, very nice view from the window, and I think there was a table in front. And yeah, so it was quite interesting in terms of replicating a practitioner's kind of space, where if in the so-called real world you were dealing with a phobia, that's where you go. And I chose the cockroach option. I didn't choose the spider option. So let's just go with the cockroach one to begin with.
Are you scared of spiders?
Well, interestingly enough, at that stage I was, but since then I've gone through my own devised, not through VR, through, hard-earned gradual exposure in real life to spiders. So no, I don't actually have a phobia anymore, which is good. But at that stage I did. so no, spiders is a bit too much. So basically started off with a cockroach scenario, and I think it started off with a drawing, like a cartoon drawing of a cockroach or something, and then gradually, it would introduce you to a still version on the desk, and then gradually that version would move, and then they'd add two more. But while this was going on, you would talk through the steps absolutely, there was no surprises. It didn't just happen suddenly. So the foregrounding was very much there in terms of what was coming. And I got to the point, I actually ran out of time, I didn't finish the entire experience, but I got to the point where there were cockroaches, multiple cockroaches on the virtual desk, and then they were on the floor. And it's hard to describe the realness of the experience, that it really, really, because I have no problem with cockroaches at all, so I was going, wow, these are cute. So, but I can imagine someone with a phobia. Sorry?
So the quality of the graphics was quite good for it,
yeah, it was, but it wasn't hyper realistic, and I think that was deliberate on the developers' part, because I think they were trying to not overwhelm, the person, because Fearless as an app, from what I can remember, is marketed not as a game, and definitely not even as an experience, but a way to really try and overcome your fears. So I think that might have been deliberate on the part of the developers, just to keep it, a bit below high fidelity version. But they were pretty realistic.
Right.
I mean, I did it at some stage, try to move out of the way of the cockroaches. So,
Yeah.
that's pretty real. So yeah, I found the experience very interesting and had, if that is an app that is, you know, something that is going to continue on with VR. I haven't used any of the apps that are used to treat PTSD, and I haven't really gone into the research, but to get back to your question, I definitely see there are absolute benefits and that it could be more successful in VR to treat something like PTSD or even, say, a fear of animals, because the physical organism isn't there, or in case of, you know, PTSD survivors, the actual stimulus or even replaying the stimulus isn't there. It's a, you know, it's a simulation. So that could work, but there are associated risks, I imagine. And again, I haven't gone into the research. Mark probably has, so I'll shut up soon and we can see what his answer is. But what if the flashbacks kind of trigger some type of latent response, you know, through dreams or some kind of triggering? So yeah, and again, I really haven't got a good grounding in the research, but yeah, so to wrap it all up, I do see potential benefits, absolutely, but I do see associated risks. Sure.
And those risks are modifying people's behaviour without their consent?
Well, not necessarily without their consent, because I think in order to embark on a treatment project like that, I would assume that a medical practitioner is involved, or if not, that you at least have to sign some, you know, TOC or at least terms and services before you go into the application. Now, that's a minefield in itself in terms of most people don't read these things, so you could, you know, propel into a VR app, not realise the consequences and do yourself some real harm. So, but again, I don't have the research to back that up.
Right.
Yeah. So should we have a look
Did
what
you
Mark's
have anything
take
else that
is?
you wanted to add, Mark?
Can you see Mark's response, Benjamin?
Okay.
I can read it out if you like, if you're not.
Okay, that would be great.
Yep. VR can change behaviour via sensory immersion, PTSD, phobias, etc., which makes sense. We're changed by the environment around us, which we perceive through our senses. The good thing is that we can experience it safely, for example, standing on the edge of a building. Maybe part of the sensory thing too is, what is it about cockroaches, vertigo, etc., that we are really reacting to? There's interesting stuff around PTSD research where they're triggering the memories and then how we react to it. The danger is if you can change behaviour and cognition in one direction, you can change it in another. That's technology. But really, marketers, politicians, etc., are changing our brains and our perceptions of the world every day. Oh, and at the end, Mark's just dropped out, unfortunately. So I'm not sure. I'm just checking back channels to see. No, there's nothing there. So hopefully Mark will be able to drop back in. But it's an interesting take in terms of that we're being bombarded every day by stimulus that can change our view of the world. I guess in terms of VR, Mark, if you can hear, what interests me is that it's so pervasive, it's so complete when you're in it, that I think in terms of other technology, you have the option to at least withdraw a bit, or maybe even kind of push to the side the effects. Whereas in VR, it's so immersive. A quick story about one of my experiences with VR horror. I'm a big horror buff, love horror, love films, used to be a massive fan of... Sorry?
I was going to say, it's a shame we couldn't do this for Halloween.
Yeah, absolutely. Only one day late.
Yeah.
But yeah, But what's funny is that when I've tried the Brookhaven experiment, I think it's called, where you shoot up zombies, absolutely terrifying, was fantastic. The one that I couldn't get through, it was called Dolls, I think, and start up the VR app, propelled into a creepy old Victorian mansion. You're in a room, there's, lightning happening outside. I'm going, yeah, seen all this stuff before.
Yeah.
Creepy doll on the windowsill. Then everything goes black, and then the lights come back on and the doll's moved. And I went, nah, not having this, no, taking the headset off, no. I don't know why.
Also,
Yep, go, Ben.
I was going to say I had a similar experience with a horror app.
Okay.
The subtler it is, the more disturbing it is.
So what happened with you?
Kind of similar, like sitting in a bed, and then the room just changes slightly, and presumably the horror was going to ramp up, but I took the headset off well before that occurred.
Wow. Okay. So are you a horror fan in general?
I am. I'm a big horror fan.
Yeah. See, that's really interesting in terms of that willing suspension of disbelief seems to be propelled to an entirely new level in VR. It's almost like you can't have that distance where you can put it into perspective or laugh it off, or it's a very different thing. It would be very interesting to see how the visceral reaction of people that aren't into horror, to see whether, it is a similar thing or not in terms of reactions. Yeah. I wonder.
I found that it is the knowledge of this space behind you, even though it's artificial, is always present. So, like, you can feel this artificial space behind you, which I found added to the horror of the experience.
Well, it's pervasive, I guess, too.
Yes.
Can you see Mark's response, or did you want me to?
I can. So Mark says, that reminds me of the entry into VR marketing by Stranger Things, that VR experience we could all do on our phones. It was fantastic. I haven't tried it. Did you try it, Mez?
Yeah, the jump scare at the end was awesome. Yeah. I mean,
let's take a look.
I'm a massive Stranger Things fan. So, I mean, just, the hat tip to Stephen King and everything in the TV series I loved. But yeah, it was interesting in terms of you knew it was coming, but it still had that effect because you're embedded in the experience. It's so immersive. And it wasn't even that engaging. You are effectively, I think, Mark, you're dragged through the space. I don't even think you have locomotion capabilities in there, but still, actually, if you're viewing it on a phone, you wouldn't have had that. I actually viewed it through a headset, so. So amazing. And it goes to show in terms of marketing where the potentials lie. If you can really, really get to an audience to that degree, that's scary stuff inside. And I don't just mean from a horror angle. I mean in terms of the embedding of core messages, what you're saying about marketers, politicians shaping realities. Yeah, interesting.
So that's probably a good time to move on to the next question, which is about your own work. I know in a conversation we had earlier leading up to this, Mez, you mentioned that in a place called Overland, you really wanted to create a work that stresses the pickle we're in globally in terms of fascism creep, but not to use a format that browbeats the audience, but allegorically lulls them into it instead with cartoonish, clumsy imagery and idiosyncratic language. Do you think then these, like what we were talking about with the visceral effects we can have on audiences, or these behavior changing apps, that there's potential for VR writers and creators to challenge the political period or people's preconceptions?
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, I would just say a resounding yes. And I'll talk about a place called Ormsby, but I just wanted to react to Mark's response there. So we just acknowledge it.
Yes.
You were on rails moving through the space, Mark, for the Stranger Things experience. And the combination of the sounds, the little jump scares, definitely, and the true fidelity to the themes of the TV show were amazing. You know, there were just the lights and the letters on the walls, and fantastic. So yeah, just to get back to the question, yeah, it's funny because it seems a going theme through this talk that we're talking about changing people's perceptions in some way or another, you know, in terms of beneficially. Sorry, I've just seen Mark's put up a awesome still from Stranger Things. Steve, right on. Yep, I'm with you.
I think Mark's discovered that he can do so much more with a Google Doc now.
Fantastic. Bring it on, Mark. Bring it on. Yeah, so basically, yeah, it seems to be a theme that we're talking about, the potentials for VR to change perceptions, both in brilliant ways, you know, phobia treatment, excellent, but also maybe more nefarious ways. And I guess creating a work like A Place Called Normalcy, I really did want to draw people in. And I'll just give a very brief description of the work. You call it an experimental fiction. It's created in a set of 3D chapters or sets, you'd call them, that are made up of a Sketchfab 3D model kind of set. So for those of you who don't know Sketchfab, it's a 3D modelling platform. So you can do 3D models and whack them up there. Basically, there's an option in there to view those models in VR and to also embed text. So I created a set of these chapters, all centred around a guy called Mr. Ormlesey. And Mr. Ormlesey lives in a place, Mr. Ormel, and Mr. Ormel lives in a place called Ormlesey, strangely enough. He's very clumsily modelled. It looks as if somebody's kind of got plasticine and moulded him. And the world at the beginning is beautiful, and he loves the world, he loves being in it. And spoiler alert, gradually it moves through very idiosyncratic language use. Mr. Ormel is transformed from a very happy-go-lucky citizen to something completely other, very sinister. And through a mixture of audio, 3D models, text, it all kind of comes together that it's, and I won't reveal any more than that for those who want to look at it, but that you can view the work across a regular browser, so on a mobile phone, but really it's designed for VR, to experience it in VR. And it's really interesting to see the differences that come about in both modalities, which is very, very interesting. I really wanted to cross that bridge where you don't just do a work that's high-end VR. So, you know, someone with a Oculus Rift or a Vive that has a high-end PC can immerse themselves. Yes, they can look at the work and go for it. But people with a Google Cardboard or just with a mobile phone can also experience the work. So accessibility issues were very important. And I think if you can cross that divide between very expensive high-end VR and just grassroots 360 video. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Mike's doing some great advertising for you.
As cool as, apparently. Yes, Jeffrey Meyer said that. And I was, yeah. Thank you very much, Mark. You're like a noble assistant. Brilliant. Yeah, so you can see here how you know, it's a very kind of clumsily rendered space, very cartoonish, but yeah, it gradually degrades, and there's so many things about the project that kind of become claustrophobic, and the audioscape becomes different and more encompassing. And I really wanted a strong social commentary behind that work. So I guess that's, to link it back to the question, that really links into, I don't want to browbeat people with what I do, but I really do believe that if you can use VR or, you know, any type of technology to create social commentary, I think why the hell not?
Yes, certainly. So do you said that, you know, it was important for you that this should also be accessible through a web browser, even though it, you know, VR is the ideal. Do you think, you know, do you think that, you know, there are technological barriers still for adoption. I mean, one of the interesting things, like you said, you were looking at VR in the early 90s. So we've had this promise of VR for almost 30 years, and it never seems to quite deliver. And even older if we include some of the earlier technologies. But we get these waves of enthusiasm which builds up, and VR is meant to break it right around the corner. Everyone will be using it. It'll be in everyone's homes, and then it crashes out. Do you think this will continue, or it will
Resolve?
pull some VR regulation? Or do you think we'll finally meet that point where we will have VR readily available, and that, well, at least in, Western consumer societies?
Should we throw to Mark for this one? It looks like he's been busy.
That is to another question. I think I will
Okay.
I will jump to that question. Oh, what's he doing? He is highlighting it. Okay, so I think this refers to an earlier question that I sent through, which I may as well ask now. We can go back to the technological one later on, because that probably has more in common with what we can do with VR in the future. At the Game Developers Conference in 2016, there was perhaps an unethical representation that described an experiment that explored the effects of VR harassment. The conclusion was that it was much worse than regular online harassment. And I suppose that brings up questions about how online VR spaces could be regulated, should they be regulated, or if there's a risk that the spaces will be only regulated by corporations in the way that online spaces are now. So Mark has put up his views on what, in regards to the rules and regulations, and the basic question is, should society have rules, which is what we have laws and human rights for? The next question is, who should make those rules? And he says the members of the community. Can you read the rest of that, Mez?
Yeah. I wasn't following the screen, so second paragraph? The next question is then?
Yeah, up to Ready Player One.
Okay. Ready Player One deals with this better in the book, where each planet within the Oasis had different rules. For example, spaces where you couldn't commit violence against another person. The question for societies is, do we want places where people can go and do whatever the hell they want with hedonistic abandon? Probably yes. Should they be able to do whatever the hell they want to whoever they want? Absolutely not. Interesting. Yeah, that's...
So I suppose that brings...
Sorry, go.
I was going to say that brings up the question that these spaces should make their own rules, but with even like Alt Space VR, which we're in at the moment, and most online spaces, these are not community driven by and large, even though communities exist within them. But at the end of the day, there's a corporation, and for Alt Space, it's Microsoft, which, corporations are not democratic organizations. They have profit in mind over other things. Can we build community spaces or community online spaces or community VR spaces where we set our own rules?
It's a very interesting question, and it plays out interesting in terms of the social spaces that exist at the moment, including Alt Space VR. And it's interesting that you bring up the Microsoft takeover, because I was a big fan of Alt Space VR before Microsoft bought them. They essentially rescued them at the 11th hour. They'd run out of venture capital, and they were going to actually shut the space down, to the point that they had an end of world party in an environment very much like this one, where they had a massive planet that was just gradually crashing into the environment. It was fantastic. I mean, not that they was, thought they was shutting down, but how they chose to go out. But then Microsoft acquired them. And two things that is interesting about that, especially in regards to what Mark was referencing, in terms of how do we regulate spaces like this. They added in the block function and mute function, which is great, all very, well thought out responses to potential trolling. I think the personal space bubble was there before Microsoft bought them out, which is basically...
is that what that bubble icon is?
Yep. So basically, if you press that and it has a dashed line about it, around it, then people can't kind of get as close to you as they might like, which is an interesting response.
Oh, right. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I noticed it's on by default.
Is it? Oh, okay. I think mine...
I think.
Right. Okay. I might have...
At least mine was.
Fair enough. Yeah, so all good responses, but it's interesting to see if that was driven by which version of the community. Did it come from before the Microsoft acquisition, or did it come from a top-down approach? And that's really interesting. They've also made changes that I think are detrimental to the space that don't necessarily have to do with regulation, but when you now come into the space, as you know, you basically are put into what's called a home space. So it's your own environment. You can customize it, have a different setup each time you enter if you like. But what you used to do is you used to go into a communal space with strangers. So you would basically come into a space with, 15, 20 people where you could interact just at random. And I found that a much more powerful experience because the social aspect really helped with embedding you in the space and treating it as a shared communal space, which is reduced now in terms of friction, in terms of the additional step that you have to do to get back to a space like that. So it's interesting to see in terms of corporate influence, what changes can be made that really do affect people's experiences in social spaces, especially, VR social spaces.
Yeah. And Mark says, reminds me of trains in Japan where they now have carriages where men aren't allowed because there were so many complaints.
Wow.
And it is quite, it is quite interesting to see that there are changes that do occur in the online spaces, not just VR, but online spaces in general, because of general outrage in the broader community and activism to change those things. But like you say, is it community-led or corporate-led or perhaps lawsuit-led for some of these corporate spaces?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess Mark has answered the technology one, but he's still... Yeah. And so that was because of a great deal. The train changes was because of the level of sexual harassment and assaults by men on the trains.
Saddening.
Yeah, and quite...
And maddening at the same time.
Quite awful, and there's no reason to believe that won't move into online spaces as well, people's behaviours. But there is, I guess, an anonymity in online spaces that makes people, again, feel like they won't get caught, which maybe the crowded trains also provided people.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say there's a great paper called Raping Cyberspace, sorry if that's a triggering word for anyone, that was actually created after an incident in a MUD, multi-user dungeon, I think that's right, in 1993 that really touches on this. And I'm just looking at the clock and going, we're running out of time, so I won't go into it in depth.
We are running out of time.
Yeah, but if anybody's interested, I think it was by Julian DeBell, really outlined a very early incident of absolute gross and terrible behaviour that, although it was on a text-based online site, really has ramifications in terms of how we should be regulating and from a grassroots level, not necessarily from a corporate level, but really, trying to embed in user practices that deal with behaviours like that.
Okay, so we have probably time for one last question. And as Mark has already kind of answered it, I might kind of join a few together. What is the future for VR? Are we looking at a utopian, a dystopian? Dystopian, is it business as usual? Is the market going to bottom out? Like, can we do some crystal ball gazing on what might happen next?
Did you want Mark to take, or do you want me to field it? I don't mind.
Both of you. Maybe you talk first, Mez, and then we can look at Mark's thoughts.
It's always an interesting way to present the kind of, either or. Are we going to have a utopia, or are we going to have a dystopia? Is this tech going to be the end of the world, or is it going to be the reinvention of the world? It's so hard to tell. And I guess from my point of view, I look at it in a more elastic sense in terms of extended reality in general. So all of those umbrella, it's an umbrella term for all those technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, all of those kind of variations that are coming to the fore right now and being experimented with, and we're all kind of, throwing stuff on the wall, seeing what sticks, what doesn't. But it's interesting. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, in a way, our mobile phone already created augmented reality when we had a constant connection to the internet, that we can outsource parts of our memory and brain to our devices that we carry around, that, if we need to know something, we can look it up easily.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's the mechanism of that immersion and how I definitely agree with you in terms of mobile phone usage has changed the scope of communication and a lot of other things. But I guess with these more engagement-based technologies or interactive technologies where you really are submerged into a space or an environment, or there's an overlay like in augmented reality that really shifts your perspective, so it's an overlay on what we term the real world. All of that, I think, has tremendous potential for education, for health, gaming. There's just so many fields that can use this in a positive way and are using it in a positive way. But of course, there's always the detrimental aspect as well. So I'm 50-50. I'm on the fence. And my emphasis at the moment is really watching what people wanted as mass adoption of VR slowly come crashing down, because in that slow simmering space, that's when all the interesting stuff happens. That's when all the interactive digital storytelling can, be injected into VR, or, VR arcades, another amazing kind of implementation of the technology. So yeah, I'm hedging my bets, let's say.
Okay, and Mark has written, I think augmented reality will become ubiquitous if it isn't already. VR will be a thing, but it'll be fragmented subcultural kind of a way until we can experience the internet as virtual reality. Then we're getting into the world of neuromancer, where people can live and exist in cyberspace.
Wow.
And he's going to buy a VR rig. He's now motivated to buy a VR rig. So unless either of you had something to say, perhaps that is a good place to end.
I just wanted to thank everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity. It's been great.
Yeah, and thanks so much, Mez. And thank you very much, Mark. And should we see if he can hear us for the last 30 seconds?
A blank screen, that's fitting. Yeah, we'll see you in VR, Mark. Get a Vive. Not that I'm advocating it, not at all.
Fantastic. And thanks to the Digital Rise Festival, there are many more events, and to Overland for supporting the event.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Okay.